On Christmas Eve, 78-year-old Douglas Cooper sat alone beneath the weak yellow light of his farmhouse kitchen, cutting canned ham beside a plate meant for someone who never came. Outside, snow buried the road through Pine Creek. Inside, his daughter's voicemail still echoed in his mind. "I'm sorry, Dad. I can't make it tonight." Douglas told himself he was used to being forgotten. Then headlights swept across the frozen yard. 3 United States Army officers stepped from a dark vehicle. The senior officer carried a narrow velvet case. When Douglas opened the door, the woman in uniform looked directly into his stunned eyes. "Mr. Cooper, something that belonged to you was buried for 52 years. Inside the case was a medal Douglas believed he had never deserved. If you've ever known someone whose sacrifice went unseen, stay with Douglas tonight." 6 months before that Christmas night in Pine Creek, Douglas Cooper still lived in Pittsburgh in a narrow third-floor apartment above a pharmacy that had changed owners 3 times in 10 years. The building was old enough to groan in winter. Pipes knocked behind the walls. The elevator stalled between floors whenever the weather turned humid. Paint peeled from the stairwell railing in long gray strips, and the hallway carpet carried the faint smell of dust, coffee, and other people's dinners. Douglas had lived there for nearly 4 decades. For most of those years it had been home because Linda had been there. Now it was simply the place where her absence lived. 3 years had passed since Linda Cooper died, but Douglas had changed almost nothing. Her blue ceramic mug still sat on the second shelf in the kitchen. Her gardening gloves remained inside a drawer beside old batteries and screwdrivers. A photograph from their 25th wedding anniversary stood on the living room bookshelf. Linda was laughing at something outside the frame, while Douglas looked at her instead of the camera. Every morning he passed that photograph. Every morning he looked away first. At 78, Douglas had developed habits that kept silence from becoming unbearable. He woke at 5:40. He made coffee strong enough to taste bitter. He listened to the local news without really hearing it. Then 3 mornings a week he took the bus across town to a maintenance company where he repaired tools, motors, generators, and whatever else younger employees had decided was easier to replace than understand. Douglas did not need the job to survive. His pension covered the basics. But money was not the reason he kept working. Work gave his hands somewhere to go. It gave the hours edges. It allowed him to return home tired enough that sometimes sleep came before memory. His supervisor, Travis Morgan, was 43 and had been with the company less than 5 years. Travis liked efficiency spreadsheets, quarterly targets, and anything that made him appear decisive in front of upper management. He did not understand Douglas. To Travis, an old man who took 20 minutes to inspect a machine before touching a wrench seemed slow. To Douglas, a man who signed off on equipment without listening to how it sounded seemed dangerous. The conflict between them had been building quietly for months. It finally broke on a Tuesday morning in June. A hydraulic lift had been brought in after one of the operators reported a sudden pressure drop. Douglas inspected the seal's found damage in the main line and marked the unit unsafe. By noon, Travis appeared beside his workbench holding a clipboard. "We need this cleared today," he said. Douglas kept cleaning grease from his fingers. "It isn't safe. It passed visual inspection." "No, it didn't." Travis lowered his voice. "The replacement parts are back-ordered. We lose the contract if this thing sits for 2 weeks." Douglas looked at the form. Near the bottom was a signature line. His signature line. "Then you lose the contract." Travis stared at him. Douglas had seen that look before, though not on Travis's face. The expectation that a man should choose obedience over conscience. "Sign it," Travis said. Douglas did not raise his voice. No. Several younger workers had stopped pretending not to listen. Travis noticed them too. His embarrassment hardened into anger. "You know what your problem is?" Cooper Douglas said nothing. "You think being old makes you automatically right?" A few people looked down. Douglas felt something tighten behind his ribs, but his expression did not change. Travis continued. "This place is trying to move forward. We can't keep stopping everything because you're uncomfortable." Douglas placed the rag on the bench. A damaged hydraulic line doesn't care whether I'm comfortable. That earned a brief laugh from someone across the room. Travis's face reddened. 20 minutes later, Douglas was called into the office. By 3 o'clock, he was carrying his belongings out in a cardboard box. A thermos, 2 screwdrivers, a photograph of Linda standing beside their first car, a pair of reading glasses. 40 years of skill reduced to objects that fit against his chest. Outside traffic moved past without noticing him. Douglas stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary. He had been fired before in his life. He had survived worse things than humiliation. Still, the walk to the bus stop felt strangely familiar. It felt like being removed from something before he had decided he was finished with it. Rachel called that evening. Douglas almost did not answer. His daughter lived on the other side of Pittsburgh and had learned over the years not to expect detailed explanations from him. "You okay?" she asked after he told her. "I'm fine." "Dad, you got fired. I'll find something else. You're 78. "I'm aware." Rachel sighed. That sound carried years inside it. Frustration, concern, resentment, love. Douglas heard all of them and responded to none. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. "I didn't say I did. You always do this. Do what turn everything into a problem with a practical answer." Douglas stared toward Linda's empty chair. He could have said that practical answers were the only ones he trusted. He could have said feelings had never stopped anything terrible from happening. Instead, he said, "It's late, Rachel." The silence that followed hurt them both. "Good night, Dad. Good night." The call ended. Neither said, "I love you." 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one came from the property management company. Douglas opened it at the kitchen table. The building had been sold. Renovations were planned. Luxury apartments. New tenants. New rents. His lease would not be renewed. He had 90 days to leave. Douglas read the notice twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it beside the salt shaker. That afternoon he walked through the neighborhood. The bakery where Linda used to buy cinnamon rolls was now a boutique fitness studio. The hardware store had become a coffee shop with glass walls. The old barber shop was empty. Construction cranes rose above buildings that had once seemed permanent. Douglas realized the city had not changed suddenly. It had changed one storefront, one neighbor, one funeral, one rent increase at a time. He had simply kept standing still while everything around him moved. That night he opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. Beneath folded sweaters lay an old army photograph. 4 young soldiers stood together under a harsh tropical sun. Douglas was 24 in the picture. Lean, dark-haired, alive in a way he barely recognized. Beside him stood 3 men whose names still returned in dreams. 2 faces had been preserved carefully. Douglas's own face had been scratched over so many times that the paper had nearly torn through. He stared at it. His fingers trembled once. Then he put the photograph back. At the rear of the drawer lay another item, a yellowed deed and a set of old keys. The farmhouse in West Virginia had belonged to Linda's uncle, who had died years earlier. No one wanted the property. The roof leaked. The land was overgrown. The nearest town, Pine Creek, barely appeared on most maps. Linda used to joke that one day they would escape there when Pittsburgh became too loud. They never did. Douglas sat on the edge of the bed holding the keys. For the first time since her death, he allowed himself to imagine leaving the city. There was nothing waiting for him in West Virginia except silence, broken boards, cold rooms, and work. Strangely, that sounded better than staying somewhere that no longer seemed to remember who he was. 3 weeks later, Douglas packed his tools, Linda's photographs, a few boxes of clothes, and the scratched army picture he still could not throw away. He locked the apartment door for the final time. Then he drove south. He did not know whether he was running away. He only knew that Pittsburgh had become the place where everything had been taken from him. And somewhere beyond the mountains, inside a ruined farmhouse surrounded by trees, Douglas Cooper hoped there might still be enough of him left to rebuild. The road into Pine Creek narrowed until Douglas Cooper began wondering whether he had missed a turn somewhere behind the mountains. Pittsburgh had disappeared hours ago. There were no apartment towers here, no crowded intersections, no construction cranes cutting across the skyline, only wooded hills, scattered houses, weathered barns, and long stretches of road bending beneath enormous trees. By late afternoon, Douglas reached the farmhouse. He stopped his truck beside a leaning mailbox and stared. Linda's uncle had called it a farmhouse. Douglas thought surviving structure would have been more accurate. The porch sagged near the eastern corner. Several shingles were missing. One upstairs window had been patched with plywood, and weeds climbed almost to the bottom of the first-floor windows. Douglas stepped from the truck. The silence surprised him. In Pittsburgh, silence had never really existed. Even at 3 in the morning, there had been engine sirens, footsteps, elevators, televisions behind walls. Here he heard wind moving through pine branches. Then a bird. Then nothing. Douglas unlocked the front door. The smell of damp wood greeted him. Inside, dust covered everything. A rusted pipe beneath the kitchen sink had leaked onto the floor. The furnace coughed twice when he tested it, and then died completely. Douglas walked slowly from room to room. A reasonable man might have turned around. Instead, he smiled faintly. For the first time in months, something needed him. He unloaded his tools. The first week became a battle against deterioration. Douglas patched the roof, replaced sections of pipe, cleared gutters, repaired 2 windows, and spent an entire afternoon convincing the old furnace to remain alive. Every night, his shoulders hurt. Every morning, he got up before sunrise and continued. He liked problems that could be touched. A rotten board could be replaced. A leaking pipe could be sealed. A broken hinge did not ask why he had failed his daughter. By the second week, people in Pine Creek had noticed the stranger at the old Cooper property. Most left him alone. One did not. Douglas was underneath his truck checking an exhaust bracket when a voice said, "You know your mailbox is crooked." Douglas slid out slowly. A boy stood beside the truck holding a bicycle. He looked about 12, thin and long-limbed with dirt on one knee and curiosity written openly across his face. Douglas glanced toward the mailbox. "I know. You're gonna fix it eventually." The boy considered this. "My name's Caleb Miller." Douglas wiped his hands. "Douglas." Caleb pointed toward the farmhouse. "You live here. That's generally why people repair houses." Caleb grinned. Douglas did not. The boy returned the next afternoon, then the afternoon after that. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he simply watched. Douglas learned that Caleb lived about half a mile away with his mother, Hannah. She worked shifts at a nurse home and occasionally cleaned vacation cabins farther up the mountain. Caleb had learned to entertain himself. Douglas suspected that was why the boy had become interested in him. On the 5th visit, Caleb arrived, pushing his bicycle instead of riding it. The chain hung loose. The rear wheel tilted at an angle. "What happened? I hit something." "What a ditch. Ditches don't usually move. I was looking somewhere else." Douglas examined the wheel. "You bent the axle." Caleb's face fell. "My mom says we can't buy another bike. I didn't say you needed another one." Douglas carried it into the shed. Caleb followed. For 40 minutes, Douglas worked while the boy watched every movement. "Why do you know how to fix everything I don't?" "Seems like you do." Douglas straightened the axle carefully. "Knowing how something works usually tells you why it stopped working." Caleb absorbed that as though Douglas had revealed an important secret. When the bicycle was finished, Caleb reached into his pocket and produced 4 crumpled dollars. Douglas stared at the money. "What's that for fixing it?" "Put it away." "But you worked on it." Douglas handed him the bicycle. "Then learn something from watching. We'll call it even." Caleb rode down the driveway with a smile so large that Douglas found himself watching until the boy disappeared. The next morning, a basket appeared on Douglas's porch. Inside were tomatoes, 6 eggs, and a handwritten note. Thank you for helping Caleb. Hannah Miller. Douglas carried the basket inside. He had forgotten what it felt like to receive something that was not a bill. Word traveled quickly. An elderly neighbor named Walter Jenkins arrived with a generator that refused to start. Douglas cleaned the carburetor. Walter returned with firewood. A farmer brought a damaged water pump. Douglas repaired it. 2 days later, a sack of potatoes appeared beside his door. Soon, Douglas realized that Pine Creek operated according to an economy Pittsburgh had forgotten. People exchanged what they had: time, food, skill, company. Nobody called Douglas a hero. Nobody asked about Vietnam. Nobody cared that a maintenance company had fired him. They only knew that when something broke, the old man at the farmhouse might be able to help. That was enough. By August, Douglas had repaired the porch and cleared most of the field. The farmhouse began changing. So did he. He ate better. He slept longer. Some evenings, Caleb sat on the porch while Douglas explained engines' electrical circuits, or why a badly driven nail could split old wood. Douglas never admitted that he enjoyed those evenings. Caleb never asked him to. One rainy afternoon, they were working inside the shed when Douglas realized he needed a smaller wrench. Toolbox in the back room, he told Caleb. Second drawer. Caleb disappeared into the house. Minutes passed. Too many. Douglas followed. He found Caleb standing beside an open wooden box. The old army photograph was in his hands. Douglas stopped. Something inside him changed instantly. Put that down. Caleb turned. I was just, put it down. The sharpness in Douglas's voice frightened him. Caleb placed the photograph on the table. Are those your friends? Douglas crossed the room and snatched it up. I told you to get a wrench. I saw the uniform and you had no business opening that box. I'm sorry. Go home. Caleb stared at him. Outside rain struck the windows. I said go home. Caleb left without another word. Douglas remained standing there. His anger disappeared almost immediately, leaving something worse behind. Shame. He looked at the photograph. 4 young soldiers, one scratched-out face. Then memory came. Not gently. Rain hammered jungle leaves. Gunfire cracked somewhere beyond the trees. A transport helicopter burned in the distance, orange flames cutting through black smoke. Someone screamed for a medic. Douglas was 24 again. His hands were covered in blood. Isaiah Brooks lay somewhere ahead. Henry Wallace was shouting, and Lieutenant Raymond Whitaker's voice tore through the chaos. Cooper, fall back. That's an order, Douglas remembered, turning toward the sound. Then toward the wounded men. He remembered making a decision. No. The memory vanished. Douglas found himself gripping the kitchen table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. For 52 years, that single word had followed him. No. He had once believed it was the bravest word he had ever spoken. Later, he had learned to believe it was the word that destroyed everything. That evening, Douglas walked to the Miller house. Caleb answered the door. Douglas held out a repaired flashlight the boy had forgotten in his shed. You left this. Caleb took it. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Douglas said, You shouldn't have opened the box. I know, and I shouldn't have yelled. Caleb looked surprised. Douglas was not a man who apologized easily. Were they your friends? Caleb asked quietly. Douglas looked toward the dark mountains. Yes. What happened to them? Douglas's jaw tightened. Not tonight. It was not an answer. But it was not a refusal either. Caleb seemed to understand. Douglas walked back toward the farmhouse beneath a clearing sky. Behind him was a boy beginning to trust him. Ahead was a house slowly becoming a home. And buried somewhere between those two things was a war Douglas had spent half a century trying not to remember. For the first time, however, the past no longer seemed willing to remain buried. For 3 nights after Caleb found the photograph, Douglas Cooper barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, Pine Creek disappeared. The repaired farmhouse became a jungle soaked by rain. The quiet mountains became artillery rolling across the horizon. The smell of wet pine became smoke, mud, fuel, and blood. And Douglas was 24 again. In 1972, Sergeant Douglas Cooper had believed courage was something simple. You protected the man beside you. You followed orders. You came home if you could. Vietnam taught him that those rules could collide. His patrol had been operating near a remote village when the mission began to unravel. Their field commander, Lieutenant Raymond Whitaker, was ambitious, polished, and desperate to prove himself. Whitaker had received warnings about movement beyond their assigned area. He ignored them. Douglas remembered studying the map beneath a plastic sheet while rain hammered the trees. "This route takes us outside the approved sector," Douglas had said. Whitaker barely looked at him. "I can read a map, Sergeant. I'm just saying we were told I know what we were told." Douglas stopped speaking. That decision would haunt him too. Hours later, the patrol entered the valley. The first explosion lifted dirt into the air. Then came gunfire. Men dropped behind trees and rocks. Someone shouted coordinates into a radio. Another soldier screamed for a medic. Douglas moved on instinct. Down. A second blast struck near a transport helicopter supporting the operation. The aircraft hit the ground hard and began burning. Smoke swallowed the clearing. The patrol fractured. Douglas found Isaiah Brooks behind a disabled vehicle with blood covering his uniform. Isaiah had been one of Douglas's closest friends. Back at camp, Isaiah talked constantly about his infant son, Michael. He carried a tiny photograph of the baby inside a plastic sleeve and showed it to anyone willing to look. That afternoon, Isaiah could barely breathe. "Don't you die on me," Douglas said. Isaiah managed a weak smile. "Wasn't planning to." Then another voice came through the gunfire. Cooper Henry Wallace. He was trapped farther down the slope. Douglas looked toward Whitaker. The lieutenant was ordering everyone to withdraw. "Fall back move," Douglas pointed toward Isaiah. "We have wounded. We don't have time. Henry's still out there." Whitaker grabbed Douglas by the vest. "Another attack is coming. We leave now." Douglas stared at him. "What about them?" "They're casualties." The words struck Douglas harder than the explosions. "They're alive." Whitaker's expression did not change. "Sergeant, fall back." Douglas looked toward the retreating soldiers, then toward Isaiah, then toward the smoke where Henry's voice had come from. Something inside him became strangely calm. "No." Whitaker stepped closer. "What did you say? I'm not leaving them." "That is a direct order." Douglas pulled away. "Then write me up when we get back." He ran toward Isaiah. Bullets struck the mud around him. Douglas reached his friend, hooked both arms beneath Isaiah's shoulders, and dragged him toward cover. Isaiah cried out. "Sorry," Douglas gasped. "Just move." Douglas pulled until his muscles burned. Two soldiers finally reached him and helped carry Isaiah behind a ridge. Douglas should have stayed there. Instead, he turned around. "Where are you going?" someone shouted. "Henry." He ran back. The battlefield had become almost impossible to understand. Smoke covered landmarks. The burning aircraft threw heat through the rain. Douglas crawled past shattered equipment until he heard coughing. He found Henry pinned beside a damaged radio station. His leg was trapped beneath metal. Near him lay the unit's radio operator, unconscious but breathing. Documents had spilled from the operator's waterproof case. Douglas reached for Henry. Then he saw the map. Several markings had been circled in red. Beside them were written warnings about the restricted sector. There was also a signed routing instruction. Raymond Whitaker's signature was at the bottom. Douglas understood immediately. Whitaker had not made a simple navigation mistake. He had knowingly moved the patrol beyond its authorized boundary, and now men were dying there. Douglas stuffed the papers back into the waterproof case. Henry grabbed his sleeve. "My leg." "I know." Douglas tried lifting the metal. It would not move. He found a broken support bar and used it as leverage. Pain tore through his shoulder. Again. Finally, the metal shifted enough for Henry to pull free. Then an explosion struck nearby. Douglas remembered light, heat, the ground rising toward him. When he opened his eyes, blood ran down the side of his face. Henry was shouting his name. Douglas forced himself upright. Together they dragged the unconscious radio operator away. Douglas could no longer feel 2 fingers on his left hand. It did not matter. They moved. By the time they reached the ridge, Douglas collapsed. The last thing he remembered was Isaiah reaching toward him. "You came back," Isaiah whispered. Douglas woke in a field hospital. His shoulder was bandaged. His head had been stitched. 2 ribs were fractured. His first question was about Isaiah. No one answered immediately. That silence told him enough. Isaiah had survived the evacuation, but his injuries were severe. Henry was alive. The radio operator was alive. Douglas believed that mattered. Then Raymond Whitaker entered. The lieutenant closed the curtain around Douglas's bed. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Whitaker said, "You disobeyed a direct order." Douglas stared at him. "I brought 3 men back. You compromised the withdrawal. You took us somewhere we weren't supposed to be." Whitaker's face tightened. "You're medicated. I saw the documents." Silence. That was when Douglas understood how dangerous the truth had become. Whitaker leaned closer. "Think carefully about what you say next, Sergeant." Douglas did. He thought about Isaiah, Henry, the radio operator, the men who had trusted their commander. "I'll tell them exactly what happened." Whitaker walked out. Douglas expected an investigation. He expected questions. Most of all, he expected the surviving men to confirm his story. But the official report came first. According to Raymond Whitaker, Sergeant Douglas Cooper had abandoned the organized withdrawal, ignored repeated orders, entered an active combat zone unnecessarily, and endangered personnel who were forced to assist him. Whitaker described the route into the restricted sector as an emergency tactical decision. The documents Douglas had seen were missing. Douglas protested. His statements were recorded. Nothing changed. Then news arrived from the hospital. Isaiah Brooks had died from complications caused by his wounds. Douglas sat alone when he heard. He did not cry. He simply stared at his hands and remembered dragging Isaiah through the mud. "You came back." Those had been among his friend's final words to him. Douglas believed Henry would testify. But Henry was transferred, then discharged. Letters Douglas sent were returned. No statement appeared. No witness came. Eventually, Douglas returned to America carrying a wound that no doctor had documented. The Army never formally branded him a coward, but the disciplinary notation remained in his record. Rumors did the rest. Douglas began questioning his own memory. Maybe Whitaker had been right. Maybe Douglas's refusal had endangered everyone. Maybe courage and recklessness were separated only by whether people survived. Years passed. He married Linda. Rachel was born. He found work. He became dependable, quiet, practical. But whenever someone needed him emotionally, Douglas felt the old battlefield opening beneath his feet. Dependence meant responsibility. Responsibility meant someone could die. So he repaired things instead. Cars, pipes, roofs, machines, anything except the part of himself still trapped in 1972. Back in Pine Creek, Douglas sat on his porch before sunrise. The mountains slowly emerged from darkness. Caleb arrived pushing his bicycle and stopped when he saw him. "You're up early, so are you." Caleb sat on the porch step. For a while, neither spoke. Then Caleb asked, "Were the men in that picture the ones you couldn't talk about?" Douglas stared across the field. One was Isaiah Brooks. What happened, Douglas swallowed. He died. Caleb lowered his eyes. "And the other, Henry Wallace. Did he die too? I don't know." Caleb looked confused. Douglas did not explain. How could he tell a 12-year-old that sometimes people survived and still disappeared? Caleb finally asked. "Were you scared?" Douglas almost laughed. For 52 years, people had reduced war to courage or cowardice. A child had asked the more truthful question. "Yes," Douglas said, terrified. Caleb considered that. "But you went back anyway." Douglas turned toward him. For a moment he could hear Isaiah again. "You came back." Douglas looked down at his scarred hands. "Yes," he whispered. "I went back. And somewhere far away, inside an army archive no one had opened in decades, a forgotten document bearing Douglas Cooper's name was waiting to explain why. By early September, people in Pine Creek had stopped referring to Douglas Cooper as the man who moved into the abandoned farmhouse. He had become simply Douglas. His truck was recognized outside the grocery store. Neighbors waved when he passed. Farmers occasionally appeared at his gate, carrying machines that rattled, smoked, leaked, or refused to start. Douglas complained every time. Then he repaired them anyway. The biggest change began inside Pine Creek's abandoned fire station. The town had replaced it years earlier, leaving the old brick building filled with broken chairs, rusted shelving, and forgotten equipment. Walter Jenkins suggested turning part of it into a community repair workshop. "We have the building," Walter said. "You have the hands." Douglas frowned. "I only have two more useful ones than most of us." Caleb Miller immediately supported the idea. Within weeks, residents cleaned the building. Hannah Miller painted the office. Walter repaired the windows, while Douglas rebuilt workbenches from salvaged lumber. Caleb followed Douglas everywhere. Whenever someone asked who had repaired something, Caleb answered before Douglas could. He did. Douglas pretended to find this irritating. Secretly, it warmed something inside him. The workshop opened without ceremony. There was no ribbon cutting, just neighbors arriving with lawnmowers, bicycles, heaters, lamps, and tools. Douglas spent hours teaching people to repair things themselves. "Don't replace something before you understand why it failed," he often said. He thought he was talking about machines. He did not realize how much the sentence described him. Hundreds of miles away, another kind of repair had begun. Captain Ethan Parker sat inside a climate-controlled Army records facility, surrounded by boxes that smelled of paper and dust. His assignment was not glamorous. Thousands of Vietnam-era personnel files were being reviewed and digitized. Many contained incomplete forms, faded reports, duplicated records, or pages placed in the wrong folders decades earlier. Ethan treated every file carefully. He understood that what looked like old paperwork could represent the most important years of someone's life. Late one afternoon, he opened a storage folder associated with a 1972 casualty report. Inside were medical records, radio logs, and several unrelated documents. One page caught his attention. Recommendation for award. The soldier named beneath it was Sergeant Douglas Cooper. Ethan read. The recommendation described extraordinary heroism under hostile fire. According to the document, Cooper had refused to abandon wounded soldiers during an emergency withdrawal. He had crossed exposed terrain, repeatedly recovered injured personnel, and assisted in rescuing a radio operator, despite suffering injuries himself. The recommended decoration was the Distinguished Service Cross. Ethan leaned closer. 2 witness signatures appeared near the bottom, but the final approval page was missing. He searched the database. Douglas Cooper. No Distinguished Service Cross. He checked again. Nothing. There was, however, a disciplinary notation from the same operation. Ethan frowned. The notation described Douglas's actions very differently. Reckless disobedience, compromised withdrawal, unnecessary exposure of personnel. The report had been submitted by Lieutenant Raymond Whitaker. Ethan compared the dates. Something felt wrong. The medal recommendation described Douglas as saving men. Whitaker's report described him as endangering them. Both could not fully represent the same event. Ethan retrieved the surviving radio logs. The first discrepancy appeared within minutes. Whitaker's report claimed the unit had entered the restricted sector because enemy activity forced an emergency rerouting. But a radio transmission recorded before contact showed that the patrol had already moved beyond its assigned boundary. Ethan read the timestamp twice. Then he found another entry. A warning had been transmitted. The patrol had been instructed to return to its authorized route. No acknowledgement from Whitaker appeared. Ethan stopped working on everything else. 2 days later, he contacted Major Rebecca Sullivan in Army Legal Affairs. Rebecca arrived with the skeptical expression of someone accustomed to historians discovering mysteries that turned out to be filing errors. "What do you have?" she asked. Ethan placed the documents across the table. "Either Sergeant Cooper received one of the strangest award recommendations I've ever seen, or somebody buried this," Rebecca read silently. Her expression changed. "Where's the approval page missing? And the witness statements also missing." "Convenient." Ethan nodded. Rebecca examined Whitaker's report. "Was he investigated?" "Not that I can find. What happened to him stayed in the Army, promoted several times." Rebecca looked at the radio logs. "And Cooper, discharged with the notation still attached to his record. They requested additional boxes. Days became weeks. Most searches produced nothing. Then Ethan discovered that several casualty documents from the operation had been filed under incorrect service numbers. One belonged to Isaiah Brooks. The name immediately caught his attention. Brooks had been identified in the medal recommendation as one of the wounded soldiers Douglas had carried toward safety. Isaiah had died after evacuation. Inside his casualty folder was a medical report. Beneath it lay a thin sheet of paper. The handwriting belonged to someone else, but the statement had been dictated by Isaiah. Ethan began reading. His pulse quickened. Isaiah described the attack. He described being wounded. He described Whitaker ordering the unit to withdraw. Then came the sentence Ethan had been searching for. "Sergeant Douglas Cooper returned for me after Lieutenant Whitaker ordered the position abandoned." Ethan continued. Isaiah stated that Douglas dragged him through enemy fire despite being ordered to leave. He also said Douglas returned again for Henry Wallace and the radio operator. At the bottom was Isaiah's mark and the signature of the medic who recorded the statement. Ethan immediately called Rebecca. She arrived 40 minutes later. He handed her the page without speaking. Rebecca read it once. Then again. This should have been in Cooper's file. Yes. How did it end up here, I don't know. Rebecca examined the casualty number written in the corner. Someone had entered one digit incorrectly. A simple mistake could explain that. But it did not explain the missing medal approval. It did not explain the missing witness material. And it certainly did not explain the contradictions in Whitaker's report. Rebecca sat down. If this is authentic, Cooper's record may have been wrong for more than 50 years. Ethan looked toward the shelves surrounding them. Then we correct it. It won't be that simple. It should be. Rebecca understood his frustration. Institutions were built from procedures. Procedures protected fairness, but they could also preserve mistakes long after the people responsible were gone. "We need corroboration," she said. Ethan looked again at the recommendation. One name remained potentially reachable. Henry Wallace, the second wounded soldier. The man Douglas had risked his life to save. They searched military databases first, then veterans' records. Eventually, they found evidence that Henry Wallace had returned to the United States and lived for years in Arizona. Whether he was still alive remained unclear. Back in Pine Creek, Douglas knew none of this. He was standing beside Caleb inside the workshop, teaching him how to repair an old gasoline generator. "Listen," Douglas said. Caleb tilted his head. "To what the engine? It sounds terrible. That's because you're hearing noise instead of listening for the problem." Douglas adjusted the fuel mixture. The engine steadied. Caleb smiled. "So machines tell you what's wrong most of the time? What about people?" Douglas paused. People were different. People hid damage. They buried evidence. They disappeared. Sometimes they spent 52 years believing a lie because everyone who knew the truth had gone silent. People are harder, Douglas said. That evening he returned to the farmhouse and placed another piece of firewood into the stove. For reasons he could not explain, he opened the wooden box again. He removed the army photograph. His thumb passed over Isaiah's face. Then Henry's. Douglas wondered whether Henry was still alive. He wondered whether the man ever remembered him. Eventually, Douglas returned the photograph to the box. He had no idea that in an army office hundreds of miles away, Ethan Parker had just received confirmation from a veterans database. Henry Wallace was alive. He was 80 years old, and for more than half a century he had been carrying a secret that could finally restore Douglas Cooper's name. Rachel Cooper knew something was wrong when Caleb Miller called her instead of Douglas. She had never met the boy. His nervous voice came through her phone on a cold October afternoon while she was leaving work in Pittsburgh. "Are you Mr. Cooper's daughter?" Rachel stopped beside her car. "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name's Caleb. I live near him." Her stomach tightened. "What happened?" Caleb explained that Douglas had been repairing shingles on the farmhouse roof when his boot slipped on damp wood. He had fallen onto the lower porch roof before rolling into a pile of leaves. Nothing was broken. Douglas had refused an ambulance. That detail sounded exactly like her father. Rachel drove to Pine Creek the following morning. When she pulled into the driveway, Douglas was standing on a ladder. She slammed the car door. "You fell off the roof yesterday." Douglas looked down. "I slipped. And today you're on a ladder, the gutter's loose." Rachel stared at him. "Get down." Douglas almost told her he was perfectly capable of deciding when to climb a ladder. Then he noticed the fear beneath her anger. He climbed down. Rachel had inherited Linda's eyes. Douglas had always found that both comforting and painful. "You drove all this way for a loose gutter?" he asked. "I drove all this way because apparently a 12-year-old stranger knows more about your life than I do." That silenced him. Inside, Rachel noticed immediately how much the farmhouse had changed. The kitchen floor had been repaired. The walls were painted. Firewood was stacked beside the stove. New curtains hung above the sink. "You did all this?" "Mostly." Rachel saw 2 jars of homemade preserves on the counter. "Where did those come from, Hannah?" "Who's Hannah?" "Caleb's mother." "And Caleb is the boy who called me yes." Rachel gave a short, humorless laugh. "So you do talk to people?" Douglas understood what she meant. He pretended not to. She stayed for lunch. Conversation remained polite until Caleb appeared at the door carrying a broken radio. "Mr. Cooper Walter said maybe you could—" Caleb noticed Rachel. "Oh." Douglas introduced them. "This is my daughter, Rachel." Caleb smiled. "You're the one from Pittsburgh." Rachel looked at Douglas. "He talks about me." Caleb realized too late that he had stepped into dangerous territory. "Sometimes." Douglas took the radio. "Come back tomorrow." After Caleb left, Rachel stood beside the window. "You're good with him. He's a good kid. You're patient with him." Douglas heard the accusation beneath the observation. "Rachel, no, I'm not trying to start something." But she was. Not because she wanted a fight, because she had spent too many years avoiding one. "You've built a whole life here," she said. "People bring you food. That kid follows you around. You teach him things. What's wrong with that?" "Nothing. That's the point." She turned toward him. "Where was this version of you when I was 12? Douglas looked away. Rachel's voice trembled. "When Mom was dying, I watched you organize medication schedules. You talked to doctors. You fixed the bathroom rail. You handled insurance paperwork. She needed those things. She needed you to cry with her." Douglas's face hardened. Rachel continued, "I needed you to cry with me." He walked toward the sink. "People grieve differently. You didn't grieve. You worked. That's not fair. When my marriage fell apart, do you remember what you told me Douglas remembered? Make sure your finances are separate." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Exactly. I called my father because my husband had left me, And you gave me financial advice. I was trying to protect you. I didn't need protection, I needed my dad. Douglas gripped the counter. Something old moved inside him. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. Instead, he realized she was not. I didn't know how, he said. Rachel blinked. Douglas rarely admitted uncertainty. Didn't know how to what? Be what you needed. Rachel's anger softened, but only slightly. Why, Douglas stared through the kitchen window. For a moment he saw jungle instead of mountains. Because I learned a long time ago that when people depend on you, sometimes they get hurt anyway. Rachel waited. Douglas continued slowly. And if you care enough, you start believing their pain belongs to you. Is this about Vietnam? He did not answer. That evening, Rachel went upstairs looking for an extra blanket. Inside a closet, she found a cardboard box marked in Linda's handwriting. Letters. Rachel sat on this floor. Most were old birthday cards and notes from relatives. Then she found envelopes tied together with faded ribbon. Letters Douglas had written Linda from Vietnam. Rachel hesitated before opening one. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, but the voice seemed to belong to another man. Young Douglas wrote about fear openly. He wrote about missing Linda. He described Isaiah Brooks as the loudest man in the unit, and Henry Wallace as someone who could make everyone laugh, even when they were exhausted. One paragraph stopped her. Isaiah and Henry are like brothers to me now. If things ever go bad out here, I'd rather die trying to bring them home than spend my life knowing I left either one behind. Rachel read it again. Her father had written that, the man who barely said I love you. She found another letter. I think about the life we'll have when I come home. Maybe a little house, maybe children. I don't want them growing up wondering whether their father loves them. Rachel covered her mouth. The irony was unbearable. Douglas found her there 20 minutes later. He saw the letters. His expression changed. Your mother kept those, all of them. Rachel held up the first letter. Who was Isaiah Douglas sat slowly on the edge of the bed. A friend. And Henry. Another friend. What happened? Isaiah died. And Henry Douglas looked toward the floor. I don't know. Rachel waited. What happened to you over there? Douglas could have told her. He came closer than he ever had. But the words stopped. Not today. Rachel closed her eyes. For once, she did not push. The next morning, she made another attempt. Come back to Pittsburgh. Douglas looked up from his coffee. I'm not leaving. You could live near me. This is my home now. You almost killed yourself fixing this home. I slipped off a roof. You're 78. And I'm still capable of choosing where I live. Rachel's frustration returned. I'm trying to make room for you in my life. I didn't ask you to. The sentence landed harder than Douglas intended. Rachel became very still. I see. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you said. She went upstairs and packed. Douglas followed her outside. Rachel. She put her suitcase in the trunk. You know what hurts most? She asked. You can make yourself necessary to everyone except your own family. That isn't true. Then prove it sometime. She got into the car. Douglas stood in the driveway as she disappeared between the trees. He wanted to call after her. He did not. The old instinct won again. Silence. That evening, Caleb found Douglas sitting alone on the porch. Your daughter left? Yes. She seemed nice. She is. Caleb waited. Did you make her mad? Douglas looked at him. Why would you assume it was me? Caleb shrugged. She drove all the way here. Douglas almost smiled. Almost. After Caleb left, Douglas entered the farmhouse and found one of the letters Rachel had accidentally left on the kitchen table. He read the words written by his 24-year-old self. I don't want them growing up wondering whether their father loves them. Douglas lowered himself into a chair. For the first time, he understood something he had avoided for decades. He had survived Vietnam by building walls around everything he loved. But Rachel had grown up on the other side of those walls. Douglas pressed the letter against his chest. Outside Pine Creek settled into darkness. And hundreds of miles away, 2 Army officers were preparing to contact the only surviving man who might finally explain why Douglas Cooper had spent 52 years believing that loving people meant eventually failing them. Henry Wallace did not answer the first telephone call. He did not answer the second either. When Captain Ethan Parker called a third time 2 days later, the 80-year-old veteran was sitting alone in the kitchen of his small Arizona home, staring at the unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. Some instincts survived age. Henry knew when the past was looking for him. The voicemail confirmed it. "My name is Captain Ethan Parker. I'm contacting you regarding Sergeant Douglas Cooper and an incident in Vietnam in 1972. Henry stopped breathing for a moment. Douglas. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. Yet he had thought about it thousands of times. Henry walked slowly into his bedroom and opened the closet. Behind winter coats he rarely needed in Arizona sat an old metal box. He carried it to the bed. The key remained taped beneath the lid. Inside were photographs, discharge papers, several letters, and one sealed plastic folder. Henry did not open it. He already knew what it contained. The following morning he called Ethan. 3 days later, Ethan and Major Rebecca Sullivan arrived at Henry's home. Henry looked smaller than Ethan expected, but his eyes were sharp. "You found Douglas?" Henry asked before inviting them inside. "He's alive," Rebecca said. Henry closed his eyes. "We're West Virginia." For several seconds he said nothing. Then his shoulders began trembling. "I thought he might be dead." Ethan watched him carefully. "Mr. Wallace, we're reviewing Sergeant Cooper's service record." Henry looked toward the metal box on his table. "You should have done that 50 years ago. Rebecca did not defend the Army." "You're right." That answer surprised him. They sat together. Ethan placed copies of Raymond Whitaker's report, the radio logs, and Isaiah Brooks's dictated statement on the table. Henry touched Isaiah's statement with 2 fingers. "You found this?" "It was misfiled." Henry shook his head. "No, not all of it was an accident." Rebecca leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Henry stared through the window. For 52 years he had imagined this conversation. In every version he had been braver. "I tried to testify," he said. Ethan exchanged a glance with Rebecca. "When after I got out of the hospital," Henry explained. He had been at 23, frightened, injured, and unable to sleep without hearing explosions. He remembered Douglas coming back through the smoke. He remembered the metal pinning his leg. Most clearly, he remembered Douglas refusing to leave. He could have saved himself, Henry said. Instead, he came for us. After recovering, Henry had prepared a written statement supporting Douglas. Before it could be formally attached to the investigation, Lieutenant Raymond Whitaker summoned him. Henry still remembered the room. Whitaker closed the door and placed several documents on a desk. Among them was a report concerning classified material lost during the operation. "He told me the radio documents disappeared because I failed to secure them," Henry said. "Was that true?" Rebecca asked. "No, I wasn't responsible for them. But Whitaker threatened to say you were." Henry nodded. "He said I could support Douglas and face an investigation myself, or sign a revised statement and go home." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What did you do?" Henry looked down. "I went home." The words seemed to age him. Rebecca spoke gently. "You were a traumatized young soldier being threatened by a superior officer. I was also Douglas's friend." Henry's voice cracked. "He went back for me when bullets were hitting the ground around him. And when it was my turn to go back for him, all I had to do was tell the truth." Henry wiped his eyes. "I was afraid." No one interrupted. "Douglas wrote me afterward," Henry continued. "I returned the letters unopened. Why? Because every envelope reminded me what I'd done." He finally opened the metal box. From the plastic folder, Henry removed several yellowed pages. Ethan immediately recognized the first. The missing metal recommendation. A complete copy, including the approval page. Rebecca stared at it. How did you get this, Isaiah? Henry removed another envelope. Before Isaiah died, he had dictated the official statement the Army had already found, but he had also written a personal letter earlier, when doctors believed he might recover. Isaiah had given the papers to Henry. He knew Whitaker was trying to change the story, Henry said. He told me if anything happened to him, I had to make sure Douglas wasn't erased. Ethan looked at him. And you kept them. For 52 years. Henry's hands trembled. I told myself I was protecting my family. Then 10 years passed. Then 20. After that, I didn't know how to appear in Douglas's life and admit I'd waited so long. Rebecca examined the recommendation. The signatures matched archived records. The approval page confirmed that Douglas had been formally recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross before Whitaker's disciplinary report disrupted the process. This was no longer merely a suspicious filing error. It was evidence of a buried act of heroism. What happened to Whitaker, Henry asked. Ethan answered. Raymond Whitaker had remained in the Army, earned promotions, and retired with honors. Afterward, he became active in veterans organizations and developed a respected public reputation. He had died 11 years earlier. Henry laughed once without humor, so he got to die respected. Rebecca understood the bitterness. There would be no courtroom confrontation, no old commander forced to answer Douglas face to face. Sometimes justice arrived too late to punish the guilty. But it was not too late to restore the truth. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Rebecca reconstructed the operation. Radio logs proved Whitaker had ignored warnings before entering the restricted sector. Isaiah's statement confirmed Douglas returned for the wounded. Henry's testimony confirmed the rescue and Whitaker's later intimidation. The complete recommendation established that officers closer to the event had considered Douglas's actions extraordinarily heroic. The Army opened a formal correction process. The disciplinary notation attached to Douglas's name for decades was now under review. Henry signed his new statement. This time he read every word before placing his signature at the bottom. When he finished, he asked Ethan one question. Does Douglas know I'm alive? Not yet? Henry nodded. Tell him. Then he changed his mind. No. Ethan waited. Henry looked toward the metal box. I need to tell him myself. Back in Pine Creek, Douglas was helping Caleb install a new workbench inside the old fire station. Caleb held one end while Douglas checked whether it was level. Little higher, Caleb lifted. There, Douglas examined the bubble. There. They lowered it into place. Caleb stepped back proudly. The workshop had changed dramatically. Tools hung neatly along the walls. Neighbors had donated equipment. Several teenagers now came after school to learn basic repairs. Douglas had never planned any of it. He had simply kept saying yes whenever someone needed help. That afternoon, Hannah Miller entered carrying coffee. You've built something good here, she told him. Douglas looked around. We built it. Hannah smiled. He was learning. Slowly. That evening, Douglas returned home and found an official envelope in his mailbox. United States Army. He stood beside the road staring at it. For several seconds he could not move. Then the old memories returned. Whitaker, the investigation, the accusation, Isaiah dying, Henry disappearing. Douglas almost tore the envelope in half. Instead, he carried it inside and placed it unopened on the kitchen table. He did not know that Henry Wallace was alive. He did not know that Isaiah's letter had survived. He did not know that the original medal recommendation had been found. All Douglas knew was that after 52 years of silence, the institution he had spent half his life trying to forget had suddenly remembered his address. And whatever was inside that envelope threatened to open a door he had spent decades trying to keep closed. The envelope remained unopened on Douglas Cooper's kitchen table for 2 days. He walked past it every morning. He made coffee beside it. He ate breakfast across from it. Once he picked it up, stared at the United States Army seal, and nearly dropped it into the wood stove. But he could not. Some wounds hurt precisely because a part of the person carrying them still wanted an answer. On the third morning, Douglas opened the envelope. The language was formal. His military service record was under administrative review concerning the 1972 operation in which he had been disciplined for disobeying a withdrawal order. New evidence had been recovered. A representative would contact him. Douglas read it twice. Then he folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "No," he whispered. He had spent 52 years learning how to live without their explanation. He would not become 24 again because someone had found a forgotten piece of paper. 2 days later, Major Rebecca Sullivan called. "Mr. Cooper, I'm contacting you regarding the review. I received the letter. We've located material that significantly contradicts the original report." Douglas stared through the farmhouse window. Caleb was outside stacking firewood. What material? Radio logs, witness documentation, an original award recommendation. Douglas stopped breathing for a moment. What award? Rebecca hesitated. A recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. Douglas laughed. There was no humor in it. "You have the wrong Douglas Cooper. We don't. I was disciplined. That disciplinary finding may have been based on false information." Douglas's grip tightened around the phone. For decades he had imagined hearing those words. Now they made him angry. Isaiah Brooks is dead. Rebecca became quiet. "Yes. My wife is dead too. I'm sorry. You think paperwork changes that? No. Then what exactly are you giving me?" Rebecca chose her answer carefully. "The truth, if you're willing to receive it." Douglas ended the call. Caleb had entered through the back door without Douglas noticing. The boy stood beside the wood box. Who was that nobody? Caleb looked at the phone. Didn't sound like nobody. Douglas gave him a warning glance. Caleb began stacking firewood. Several minutes passed. Then he asked, "Was it about the army?" Douglas turned. "You were listening, not on purpose. That usually means yes." Caleb shrugged. Douglas sat down heavily. "They say some things in my record might be wrong. Were they?" "Were they?" Douglas stared at his hands. "I don't know what I believe anymore." Caleb considered this. "If somebody told everyone I did something terrible when I didn't, would you tell me to just let them?" Douglas looked up. "That's different. Why? Because you're 12. So you have your whole life ahead of you." Caleb frowned. "Does that mean the truth only matters when you're young?" Douglas had no answer. The question followed him after Caleb left. 2 days later, Rachel arrived. Rebecca had contacted her after Douglas reluctantly listed her as next of kin. Rachel entered the farmhouse carrying the army letter. "You knew about this?" Douglas nodded. "And you weren't going to tell me?" "There was nothing to tell. They found evidence that you were falsely accused. It happened 52 years ago. That doesn't make it nothing." Douglas walked toward the window. Rachel refused to let him escape. "Tell me what happened. I've told you enough. No, Dad. You've given me pieces my entire life." Douglas turned. Rachel's eyes were wet. "I read your letters. I know who you were before you came home. I need to understand what happened to that man." Douglas felt the old wall rise. This time he was too tired to maintain it. So he told her. He told Rachel about Raymond Whitaker ignoring the warning. He told her about the attack, about Isaiah bleeding beside the disabled vehicle, about Henry trapped under metal, about the order to withdraw. Then he told her about the word that had shaped the rest of his life. "No." "I went back," Douglas said. Rachel remained silent. "I dragged Isaiah out. Then I went for Henry." His voice weakened. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You were. Isaiah still died. That wasn't your fault." "I couldn't believe that." Douglas looked toward Linda's photograph. "When I came home, I started thinking maybe Whitaker was right. Maybe caring made me reckless. Maybe when people depended on me, I made things worse." Rachel finally understood. Her father had not become emotionally distant because he felt too little. He had become distant because feeling deeply terrified him. When Mom got sick, Rachel whispered, You thought you were going to fail her too. Douglas nodded. So you fixed things. The railing, her medication, appointments, anything I could control. But you wouldn't let us see you afraid, no. Why, Douglas swallowed. Because if I admitted how much I loved you both, I had to admit how much I could lose. Rachel began crying. Douglas instinctively wanted to hand her a tissue, to solve something. Instead, he crossed the room and embraced his daughter. Rachel froze. Then she wrapped both arms around him. For several minutes, neither spoke. 50 years of explanations could not repair everything in one embrace. But it was a beginning. Later that evening, Rebecca called again. This time, Douglas answered. She explained that Isaiah Brooks had dictated a statement before his death, confirming Douglas's rescue. She explained the radio logs. Then she told him about Henry Wallace. Douglas stood abruptly. Henry, he's alive. Douglas gripped the chair. For 52 years he had imagined Henry dead, ashamed, indifferent, or unwilling to remember. He tried to testify for you, Rebecca continued. Douglas said nothing. Whitaker threatened him. Henry was frightened into silence. He still stayed silent. Yes, the words were not softened. Douglas appreciated that. Rebecca told him Henry had preserved a complete copy of the original medal recommendation and a personal letter from Isaiah. Douglas sat down. Why didn't he send them? You'll need to ask him. Anger rose beneath Douglas's grief. Henry had possessed the truth for decades. Douglas was not ready to forgive that. Perhaps he never would be. Rebecca then explained that the Army was moving to correct his record and reconsider the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation. I don't want a ceremony, Douglas said. We haven't discussed one yet. I'm discussing it now. Understood? And if you correct that report, Isaiah's name goes in it. Rebecca paused. Explain what you want. People are going to read that I went back for him. I don't want him reduced to the man I carried out. Douglas's voice became firm. He kept men calm when everything fell apart. He was still encouraging people when he could barely breathe. If you're correcting history, correct all of it. Rebecca looked down at her notes. After 52 years of injustice, Douglas's first demand was recognition for a dead friend. I'll make sure his role is documented, she said. Douglas closed his eyes. Then do what you have to do. When the call ended, Rachel remained beside him. You're accepting the review. The record should be corrected. And the medal. Douglas looked toward the Army photograph. I don't know. He walked to the wooden box and removed it. For the first time in decades, he studied the scratched-out image of his younger face without turning away. He had spent half a century punishing that young soldier. Maybe Whitaker had lied. Maybe Henry had failed him. Maybe the Army had allowed the truth to disappear. But Douglas had participated in the punishment too. He had believed the worst version of himself, because believing it felt easier than grieving everything he could not save. Rachel touched his shoulder. You went back for them. Douglas looked at Isaiah's face. Yes. And you came home. He nodded. Rachel squeezed his hand. Maybe it's time you came home from the rest of it too. Outside, autumn wind moved through the mountains. Nothing about the past had changed. Isaiah was still gone. Linda was still gone. Rachel's childhood could not be rewritten, but for the first time in 52 years, Douglas Cooper allowed himself to consider that the truth had not arrived too late. Perhaps justice was not about receiving back the years that had been stolen. Perhaps it was about refusing to surrender the years that remained. By the first week of December, Pine Creek looked as though winter had erased its roughest edges. Snow covered broken fences and abandoned machinery. White drifts softened the shoulders of the mountain road. Christmas lights appeared along storefront windows around porch railings and across the entrance to the community hall. Douglas Cooper had never cared much for decorations. Linda had. For 47 Christmases, she had insisted on putting lights around every window they could reach. She baked too much food, bought gifts months too early, and played the same Christmas records until Douglas threatened to hide them. He never did. Now, whenever Christmas music played inside Pine Creek's grocery store, Douglas found himself missing the very things he once pretended to tolerate. He had planned to spend the season quietly. Pine Creek had other plans. 3 weeks before Christmas, the heating system inside the community hall failed during a cold snap. The hall was supposed to host the town's Christmas dinner. Walter Jenkins arrived at Douglas's farmhouse before breakfast. "We have a problem. A problem. You always have a problem. That's why I come here." Douglas sighed and reached for his coat. The heating unit was older than Caleb. Douglas spent 6 hours examining it. A contractor from this nearest large town estimated that replacement would cost thousands of dollars and take weeks. Douglas refused to accept that. He dismantled the circulation pump, cleaned years of buildup from the system, replaced 2 damaged electrical components, and rebuilt a worn connection using parts salvaged from the old fire station. Caleb handed him tools. Walter supplied coffee. By evening, warm air flowed through the hall again. People applauded. Douglas immediately looked uncomfortable. "I fixed a heater," he muttered. "I didn't cure anything." Hannah Miller smiled. "To this town in December, there isn't much difference." The next afternoon, someone left a homemade pecan pie on Douglas's porch. Then came a basket of bread, then firewood. Douglas complained that people were turning his house into a grocery store. But he never returned anything. Something had changed after Rachel's last visit. They spoke more often. The conversations were still awkward. Decades of emotional distance did not disappear because of one confession, but Douglas was trying. When Rachel called, he no longer searched for an excuse to end the conversation. Sometimes he asked about her day. Sometimes he told her about Caleb. Once, almost accidentally, he told her he missed her. Rachel had become silent. Douglas thought the call had dropped. Then she whispered, "I miss you too, Dad." A week later, Rachel promised to come to Pine Creek for Christmas. "Christmas Day?" Douglas asked. "Christmas Eve. I'll stay overnight." Douglas tried to sound casual. "All right." Rachel smiled on the other end. "You sound excited." I said, "All right." "That's practically a celebration coming from you." After they hung up, Douglas stood in the kitchen for several minutes. Then he drove into town. He bought a small turkey, potatoes, apples, celery, bread, sage, ingredients for Linda's apple stuffing recipe. At a small store near the courthouse, Douglas noticed 2 Christmas mugs on a shelf. One had a green pine tree. The other had a red cardinal. He bought both. The cashier placed them carefully into a paper bag. "Company coming, my daughter?" Douglas heard the pride in his own voice. He did not hide it. On Christmas Eve morning, snow began falling before sunrise. Douglas started cooking early. Linda's recipe card rested beside the stove, written in her looping handwriting. He followed it exactly. At 11:30, Rachel called. Douglas answered immediately. "Road's bad there." There was a pause. "Dad, I have a problem." His hand stopped above the cutting board. Rachel explained that her teenage son had been traveling back to Pittsburgh after spending several days with his father. His connecting flight had been canceled because of the storm. He was stranded several hours away. Rachel needed to help coordinate another route and might have to drive part of the distance herself. "I'm so sorry," she said. Douglas stared at the second Christmas mug. "It's fine. It isn't. Your son needs you. I promised you. And I'm telling you to stay there." Rachel knew his voice. It was the old voice. Calm, practical, protected. "Dad." "I'm fine, Rachel." She closed her eyes. "Please don't shut me out because I can't get there tonight. I'm not." But part of him already had. After the call, Douglas stood motionless. He knew Rachel had a legitimate reason. He knew she loved him. He knew this was not abandonment. Yet grief did not always listen to reason. He removed the red cardinal mug from the table and placed it back inside the cabinet. Then he covered the extra plate. Across the country, Major Rebecca Sullivan was dealing with a very different Christmas problem. The review of Douglas's record had finally reached its conclusion. The disciplinary notation based on Raymond Whitaker's account had been formally invalidated. Douglas Cooper's service record would be corrected. More importantly, the original recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross had been reconsidered using Isaiah Brooks's statement, Henry Wallace's testimony surviving radio logs, and the complete recommendation Henry had preserved. Final authorization had arrived. The medal would be awarded. The Army initially planned a formal presentation after New Year's. Henry Wallace objected. "He's waited 52 years, Henry told Ethan Parker over the telephone. "Why are we asking him to wait another month? Because ceremonies are easier to schedule," Ethan understood. Rebecca did too. Douglas had already said he wanted no grand ceremony. No stage, no press, no speeches before strangers. Rebecca contacted Colonel Michael Brooks. Michael had followed the review closely after learning about his father, Isaiah. He had been an infant when Isaiah died. Growing up, Michael knew his father mostly through photographs and stories from his mother. Now he knew something else. A young sergeant named Douglas Cooper had crossed enemy fire to bring Isaiah home. When Rebecca asked whether Michael wanted to participate in delivering the medal, his answer came immediately. Yes. Weather complicated everything. Road conditions worsened across West Virginia. The original plan was nearly abandoned. Then Michael said what Henry had said. "He's waited long enough." By late afternoon, Rebecca Sullivan, Ethan Parker, and Colonel Michael Brooks were traveling toward Pine Creek. Inside the vehicle, resting securely in a narrow velvet presentation case, was the Distinguished Service Cross. Michael carried something else inside his coat, Isaiah's original letter. Back at the farmhouse, Douglas knew none of this. Darkness came early. Snow gathered against the windows. He carved several slices from the small turkey-spooned potatoes onto his plate, added Linda's stuffing, and finally cut a piece of store-bought pie. The meal was too large for one person. Douglas sat beneath the kitchen lamp. Across from him remained the empty chair. He looked toward the cabinet containing the second mug. For a moment he imagined Linda sitting there, then Rachel as a little girl, then Isaiah laughing beside a muddy tent 54 years earlier. Douglas lowered his eyes. "Merry Christmas," he whispered to no one. He began eating. 30 minutes later, a light moved across the kitchen wall. Douglas looked up. Headlights. They swept across the snow-covered yard and stopped near his porch. Douglas frowned. Nobody in Pine Creek would be foolish enough to visit in weather like this. Without calling first? A dark government vehicle stood outside. 3 figures emerged. Douglas slowly rose from his chair. The first wore the uniform of a major. The second was a captain. The third was a colonel. The colonel carried a narrow velvet case. Douglas's heart began pounding. He stepped toward the door. Outside, 3 Army officers crossed the snow toward the farmhouse of a man who had spent 52 years believing the Army remembered him only for the worst accusation ever attached to his name. Major Rebecca Sullivan raised her hand and knocked. Douglas stood on the other side. For several seconds he could not make himself open the door. Then came a second knock. Christmas dinner cooled behind him. Snow fell beyond the windows, and 52 years of buried truth waited on his porch. Douglas Cooper opened the farmhouse door slowly. Cold air rushed into the hallway, carrying loose snow across the threshold. Major Rebecca Sullivan stood closest to him. Captain Ethan Parker was beside her. Behind them stood a tall colonel Douglas had never seen before. The colonel held a narrow velvet case. For several seconds, Douglas said nothing. He had imagined the Army returning to his life in many forms over the decades. A letter, an apology, perhaps another investigation. "Never this, Mr. Cooper," Rebecca said softly. Douglas looked from her face to the case. "You picked a strange night for government business." Ethan almost smiled. Rebecca did not. "We didn't come because it was convenient." Douglas understood immediately. "You finished the review?" "Yes." Snow collected on their shoulders. Douglas stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The three officers entered the small kitchen. Douglas suddenly became aware of everything around them. The worn table, Linda's recipe card beside the stove, the single plate, the empty chair. Rebecca noticed, too. So did Ethan. Neither mentioned it. Douglas pointed toward the stranger. "And you are?" The colonel stepped forward. Colonel Michael Brooks. The surname struck Douglas first. Brooks. He stared at the man. Michael had Isaiah's eyes. Older, certainly. More guarded, but unmistakable. Douglas's face lost color. "Brooks." Michael swallowed. "My father was Isaiah Brooks." Douglas reached for the back of a chair. For an instant, the farmhouse disappeared. He saw a 20-something soldier laughing beneath the tropical sun, holding a photograph of an infant inside a plastic sleeve. "My boy Michael." Isaiah had shown that picture so many times the men joked they knew the baby better than their own relatives. Douglas stared at the colonel. "You were the baby." Michael's composure nearly broke. "Yes, sir." Douglas lowered himself into the chair. "I carried your picture once." Michael looked confused. "Your father kept it inside his shirt. After he was wounded, it fell into the mud." Douglas's voice trembled. "I picked it up and put it back." Michael's eyes filled. Nobody spoke. Finally, Rebecca placed a folder on the table. "Mr. Cooper, the review is complete." Douglas looked at it, but did not touch it. "The disciplinary notation connected to Lieutenant Raymond Whitaker's report has been removed from your official record." Douglas remained still. Rebecca continued. "The evidence establishes that Whitaker's report contained materially false information regarding the operation, the withdrawal, and your actions. 52 years. Douglas had waited 52 years to hear that. Yet there was no triumph, only exhaustion. "So I wasn't reckless." "No," Ethan said. Douglas looked at him. "You went back for wounded men, when you knew doing so could cost your life." Ethan paused. "The historical record will reflect that." Douglas looked down. Historical record? The phrase seemed almost absurd. History had been living inside him every night. Rebecca nodded toward Michael. "There's more." Michael placed the velvet case on the table. Douglas stared at it. "No." Michael stopped. "I don't need that. Mr. Cooper, I agreed to the correction. I didn't agree to pretending a medal fixes 52 years. Michael's hand remained on the case. "It doesn't." Douglas looked up. Michael continued. "It doesn't give me my father back either." That silenced him. Michael opened the case. The Distinguished Service Cross rested inside. Douglas's eyes moved toward it despite himself. "The original recommendation was recovered," Rebecca explained. "Henry Wallace preserved a complete copy. Combined with your recovered records, Isaiah's statement, Henry's testimony, and the radio logs, the recommendation was reconsidered." Douglas stared at the medal. "Henry." "He signed a new statement," Ethan said. Douglas's jaw tightened. "A little late." "Yes," Rebecca replied. She did not ask him to forgive. Michael reached inside his coat. "My father left something too." He removed a protected envelope. Douglas recognized Isaiah's handwriting before the letter was unfolded. His hands began trembling. "I can't." Michael placed it gently before him. "I think he wanted you to." Douglas finally took it. The paper was fragile. Isaiah had written it while hospitalized, believing he might recover. Most of the letter concerned his wife and infant son. Then Douglas reached the final paragraph. His vision blurred. Isaiah had written that if he did not make it home, Douglas needed to know one thing. He had come back. When everyone else was moving away from danger, Douglas had turned toward the men still trapped inside it. Isaiah described that decision not as disobedience, but as courage, not the absence of fear. The refusal to let fear decide who deserved to be abandoned. Douglas stopped reading. His shoulders shook. For decades he had refused to cry in front of Linda, in front of Rachel, at funerals, in hospitals. Now there was nowhere left for the grief to go. He covered his face. I tried to get him out. Michael stepped closer. I know, I thought he was going to make it. I know, I should have been faster. Michael's voice broke. You went back when other men were ordered to leave. Douglas looked at him. Michael was crying now too. My father got to know someone refused to abandon him. My mother got him back long enough to say goodbye. Douglas had never known that. The information struck him harder than the metal. Isaiah had made it home alive. Briefly. Long enough to see his family. Douglas pressed the letter against his chest. Rebecca quietly asked, would you allow us to present the decoration? Douglas looked around the kitchen. No speeches? No speeches, she promised. No photographs? None. Douglas stood. There was no audience, no military band. Only 3 officers, an old kitchen Christmas lights visible through a window, and a dinner growing cold. Michael removed the medal. Sergeant Douglas Cooper, on behalf of a country that took far too long to correct the record, I have the privilege of returning something that should have reached you decades ago. He placed the Distinguished Service Cross into Douglas's hands. Douglas stared at it. The medal felt surprisingly heavy. Then headlights appeared outside. Everyone turned. A car stopped near the porch. Rachel Cooper emerged into the snow. Douglas whispered her name. Rachel hurried toward the house. When Douglas opened the door, she was already crying. My son got home safely, she said breathlessly. And I realized I was using the storm as an excuse because I was scared of driving. Douglas looked at her. I couldn't let you spend Christmas alone. Rachel noticed the officers. Then the medal in his hand. Her mouth opened. Dad. Before Douglas could explain more, headlights appeared. An old pickup. Then another vehicle. Caleb jumped out first, carrying a covered dish. Hannah followed with a basket. Walter Jenkins emerged from the second truck, complaining loudly about the roads. Caleb saw the uniforms. His eyes widened. What happened? Douglas looked around his kitchen. 30 minutes earlier, he had been eating alone. Now Rachel was removing her coat. Hannah was placing food on the counter. Walter was arguing that his pie needed refrigeration. Ethan was helping clear space. Rebecca accepted a cup of coffee. Michael stood beside Isaiah's letter. Caleb stared at the medal. Is that yours? Douglas looked down at it. Once the question would have frightened him. He would have hidden it, minimized it, changed the subject. Instead, Douglas nodded. Yes. Caleb smiled. I knew you went back. Douglas felt something inside him finally loosen. Rachel opened the cabinet and found the red cardinal Christmas mug. She placed it beside Douglas's green one. The extra plate returned to the table. Then another was added. And another. Soon the small kitchen could barely hold everyone. Douglas sat among them with Isaiah's letter beside Linda's recipe card. The medal remained on the table. For once, nobody treated him like a forgotten old soldier. Nobody treated him like a hero either. They treated him like Douglas, a father, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend. Outside, snow continued covering the mountain road. Inside, the table, prepared for one, became crowded with voices. Douglas looked at Rachel, laughing with Caleb. Then at Michael Brooks, the grown son of the soldier he had carried through gunfire. For 52 years, Douglas had believed that one terrible day proved he had failed the people who depended on him. On Christmas night, surrounded by the people who had chosen to come through the snow for him, he finally began to understand something different. He had not been forgotten. The truth had simply taken far too long to find its way home. The Distinguished Service Cross remained on Douglas Cooper's kitchen table long after everyone had gone home. For several days after Christmas, he did not move it. Morning sunlight touched it. Evening shadows covered it. Douglas would make coffee sit across from the medal and stare at the small piece of metal that represented 52 years of misunderstanding. He had imagined justice differently, When he was younger, he thought justice would feel like victory. Raymond Whitaker would admit what he had done. Henry Wallace would return and defend him. Someone in authority would apologize, and Douglas would immediately become the man he had been before Vietnam. But justice had arrived when Whitaker was already dead. Isaiah was gone. Linda was gone. Douglas was 78. No correction could give Rachel another childhood. No medal could place Linda back beside him. The truth had come home. The years had not, and yet something inside Douglas had changed. He no longer looked at his 24-year-old self with disgust. One morning he opened the wooden box and removed the old army photograph. His own face was still scratched nearly beyond recognition. Douglas ran his thumb across the damaged paper. For decades he had blamed the young man in that photograph for surviving. Now he whispered something he had never been able to say. You did what you could. It was not absolution. Not yet. But it was enough to begin. 3 months later, Pine Creek organized a small gathering for local veterans at the restored fire station. Rebecca Sullivan had contacted Douglas about larger events. There had even been interest in telling his story publicly. Douglas declined. He did not want lights or cameras. He wanted the people who had shared his ordinary life. Walter, Hannah, Caleb, Rachel, his grandson, and one other person. Henry Wallace. When Henry entered the fire station, Douglas recognized him immediately. Age had changed everything except the eyes. Henry stopped several feet away. Neither man moved. Caleb, standing near the workbench, sensed something important was happening and quietly stepped back. Henry finally spoke. Doug. Nobody had called him that in decades. Douglas's jaw tightened. Henry looked fragile beneath the weight of what he had carried. I'm sorry. Douglas said nothing. Henry continued. I rehearsed what I'd say to you for 50 years. You had my address. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Henry lowered his head. I know. You had the recommendation, yes. You had Isaiah's letter. Yes. And you stayed silent. Henry's eyes filled. Yes. Douglas felt anger rise. For 52 years he had wondered why Henry disappeared. Now the man stood before him, asking forgiveness that Douglas was not certain he could give. I was scared, Henry said. Whitaker threatened me and I believed him. But that explains what I did. It doesn't excuse what came after. Douglas looked at him. Henry understood the difference. I should have found you. Yes. I should have spoken. Yes. I failed you. Douglas swallowed. Yes. Henry began crying. Douglas did not rescue him from the truth. Forgiveness, he had learned, was not another form of denial. After a long silence, Douglas said, I spent most of my life letting what Whitaker did decide who I became. Henry wiped his face. I'm sorry. And if I spend whatever time I have left hating you, then he still gets to decide. Henry looked up. Douglas stepped closer. Forgiveness doesn't mean it didn't happen. I know, it means I'm done carrying it everywhere. Henry nodded. Then Douglas embraced him. It was not the embrace of two young soldiers reunited. Those men no longer existed. It was the embrace of two old men, accepting that neither could repair the past, but both could choose what happened next. Rachel watched from across the room. She understood that her father was doing more than forgiving Henry. He was beginning to forgive himself. Life in Pine Creek continued. Douglas returned to the workshop. But the old fire station gradually became more than a place for repairing lawnmowers and generators. Several teenagers began coming after school. A young veteran named Aaron Price started visiting after hearing about Douglas from Walter. Aaron had struggled to settle into civilian life and rarely spoke about his military service. Douglas did not pressure him. He simply handed him tools. Ever rebuilt a carburetor? No. Then today you will. Others followed. Veterans, teenagers, neighbors who needed somewhere useful to spend an afternoon. Douglas created no complicated program. There were only a few rules. Nobody was mocked for not knowing something. Nobody worked alone if they needed help. And nothing was thrown away until someone understood why it had stopped working. Caleb loved the last rule. "That's your whole philosophy," he told Douglas. "I don't have a philosophy. You definitely do." Douglas shook his head, but he smiled. Rachel began visiting twice a month. Sometimes she brought her son. Douglas discovered that being a grandfather required skills he had avoided as a father. Listening without solving. Speaking without hiding. Admitting fear. One evening, his grandson asked about Linda. For years, Douglas would have answered with facts. She was born in 1950. They married after he returned from Vietnam. She worked at a library. Instead, Douglas told him how Linda laughed whenever she burned biscuits, how she danced badly in their kitchen, how she once drove 40 miles because Douglas had forgotten his lunch. Rachel listened from the doorway. She heard her father telling stories she had never known. Later, she hugged him. "I wish you'd talked like this when I was younger." Douglas nodded. "So do I." He did not defend himself. That mattered. During summer, Douglas built a wooden display case in the workshop. Caleb helped. "Is this for the medal?" Caleb asked. "Partly." When they finished, Douglas carried it home. He placed the Distinguished Service Cross inside. Beside it went the restored copy of Isaiah Brooks's photograph. On the other side, Douglas placed his favorite wedding picture of Linda. The medal stood between a brother he had lost and the woman who had spent decades loving the damaged man who came home. Douglas did not hang the case in the center of the room. He placed it quietly on a shelf. Recognition mattered, but it no longer defined him. The following Christmas, Pine Creek disappeared beneath snow again. This time Douglas needed more than 2 mugs. Rachel arrived early with her son. Caleb and Hannah came carrying food. Walter brought another pie. Henry traveled from Arizona. A familiar vehicle pulled into the driveway. Colonel Michael Brooks stepped out with his wife and children. Douglas met them on the porch. Michael's youngest boy looked up at him. "Are you Grandpa Isaiah's friend?" Douglas felt his throat tighten. "Yes." The child smiled. "My dad told me you brought him home." Douglas looked toward Michael. For 53 years, he had focused on the fact that Isaiah eventually died. Now he finally understood the other half of the story. Isaiah had reached home. His wife had seen him. His infant son had been near him. The rescue had mattered. Douglas knelt carefully before the boy. "Your grandfather was very brave." Inside, the table filled quickly. There were too many dishes, too many chairs, too much laughter. Exactly the kind of Christmas Linda would have loved. At one point, Douglas stepped away and stood beside the display case. He looked at the medal. Once he had believed recognition would prove his worth, then he had spent decades believing the absence of recognition proved he had none. Both ideas had been wrong. His value had never depended on Raymond Whitaker's report. It had never depended on an army file. It had never depended on a medal. Douglas Cooper had possessed worth when he was 24 and terrified, but still turned back toward wounded friends. He had possessed worth when he repaired machines in Pittsburgh, when he cared for Linda, when he failed Rachel emotionally but continued loving her imperfectly, when he arrived at a broken farmhouse believing his useful years were finished. Justice had restored his name, but justice alone had not restored his life. People had done that. Rachel refusing to give up on him, Caleb knocking on his door, Henry finding the courage to return, Michael carrying his father's gratitude across generations, and Douglas himself finally choosing not to spend the rest of his life imprisoned by something that happened in 1972. Rachel called from the dining room. "Dad, we need another chair." Douglas smiled. A year earlier, he had prepared a table for one. Now there was not enough room. "I'll get one." He walked toward the workshop, then paused at the doorway. Behind him came laughter, family, friends, life. Douglas looked back once. At 79, he finally understood that surviving was not the same as living. For decades he had survived. Now, with whatever years remained, Douglas Cooper intended to live. The greatest victory of his long war was not the medal resting inside a wooden case. It was finally believing that the young soldier who went back deserved to come home too.